Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 43. Our return to Baker Street coincides with that of Sherlock Holmes, who after 10 years down the proverbial plug hole, reappeared in today's story, The Adventure of the Empty House, in September 1903. And here's Paul to remind us of the story.
3 years after Sherlock Holmes' fatal encounter with Professor Moriarty at the Reichenbach Falls, Dr. John Watson still retains an interest in criminal affairs and, like most of the London public, is gripped by the Park Lane mystery, the inexplicable locked-room murder of the Honourable Ronald Adair. In a visit to the site of the crime, Watson has a bad-tempered encounter with a decrepit old bookseller, who later calls upon him to apologise. This unpromising meeting proves to be a turning point in Watson's life, and once more, the game is afoot.
After 2 series of short stories, Conan Doyle dispatched Sherlock Holmes to a watery grave in The Adventure of the Final Problem, which we discussed in episode 34. But 8 years later, in 1901, he brought Holmes and Watson back for a curtain call in The Hound of the Baskervilles, an adventure specifically set before the detective's death. Now, to say that The Hound of the Baskervilles was a publishing success is an understatement. The Strand is believed to have increased its circulation by 30,000 copies, and Newnes printed 25,000 copies of that beautiful red and gold first edition. And in the USA, it sold 50,000 copies in the first 2 weeks alone and returned to the press several times. Now, from our perspective, it seems inevitable that Sherlock Holmes would have returned, but that had not always been the case. For years, Smith, McClure, and others had unsuccessfully entreated Conan Doyle to bring back Holmes and Watson. But now, with the phenomenal publishing success of The Hound, Conan Doyle was minded to put pen to paper again. He was also, it should be said, a very different man from the rising author who'd killed Holmes almost 10 years earlier, a public figure, the most successful commercial writer of his day, and now a knight of the realm. And as Richard Lancelyn Green observed, in 1903, Conan Doyle had the confidence to continue and the desire to do so, and at no other time would the financial rewards have been greater. And those financial rewards this time did not start in the UK but came from the US. In spring 1903, Norman Hapgood, the new editor of Collier's, approached Conan Doyle to pen a new series of Sherlock Holmes short stories. On the 4th of March 1903, Conan Doyle wrote to his brother Innes that he had had a great bargaining with those Americans. Collier's had offered him somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000 for the global rights to the stories, but Conan Doyle had cannily offered them only the US rights, knowing that he could get a second fee from the Strand for UK publication. And in the end, he accepted something in the region of $30,000 for 8 stories with an option to write more. Innes was delighted and wrote, "Good old Sherlock, I think he has had quite a long enough rest." Still, there was some trepidation about bringing Holmes back from the dead, which in this case came from an unexpected source, Conan Doyle's mother, who had actually stopped her son killing Sherlock Holmes at the end of the adventures. Conan Doyle tried to put her mind at rest at the end of March 1903, 2 weeks after signing with Collier's and just after he had finished writing The Adventure of the Empty House, when he wrote, "I have done no short Sherlock Holmes stories for 7 or 8 years, and I don't see why I should not have another go at them and earn 3 times as much money as I can by any other form of work." The Adventure of the Empty House was then first published in Collier's in the USA in September 1903, and very shortly thereafter in the Strand in the UK. And Sherlock Holmes' return would not have come as a surprise to anyone, because the newspapers had, as early as April 1903, said that he was going to be back. The story was then first collected in The Return of Sherlock Holmes in 1904, and it's said to be the most hotly debated story in the canon, being the subject of more articles in the Baker Street Journal than any other.
Yeah, it's not really surprising. It's attracted a great number of articles. So obviously, there's a lot going on in this story, as we'll go on to discuss. But it's always been a controversial one. This story and the Return as a collection. There's the often quoted story. I think Conan Doyle himself came up with the story about the Cornish fisherman.
Yes,
Who said that Sherlock was never the same man after he came out of the Reichenbach Falls. I mean, you could argue one way or the other. You could actually say these stories are better than some of the earlier ones. But it's always struck me as odd those people who are really willing to criticise the Return, that you don't hear the same complaints about The Hound of the Baskervilles, which was written not long before these. Where people are perfectly willing to accept that this is the same Holmes, this is pre-Reichenbach Holmes, as if Conan Doyle wrote The Hound of the Baskervilles in 1890 or 91, rather than 1900. So there's this kind of dichotomy always going on there about Holmes and his character. To me, of course, he's going to be a bit different because he, as again we're going to discuss, he's had 3 years, jogging around the world.
Yeah.
He is going to be a different man, of course. And actually, I think Conan Doyle expresses that rather well. I think there's too much readiness to criticise the Return, and again, I think some people are perhaps looking at this in the light of putting the Return in with his Last Bow and the Casebook.
Yes.
Rather than the earlier set, and they get themselves into this mindset that the latter stuff just isn't as good. So it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think that's true, and also, I think there was also some contemporary concern about what Sherlock Holmes would be like when he returned as well. In fact, we get a sort of very comic version of that because P.G. Wodehouse wrote a small pastiche of sorts in September 1903 called The Prodigal, which came out in the Punch. It actually came out, I think, just after The Empty House had come out in Collier's and just before it came out in the Strand. And the Punch had been mercilessly mocking Conan Doyle for years. And then they have this quite fun story in which Wodehouse has Watson walking down the Strand and meeting Sherlock Holmes coming the other way. And Sherlock Holmes is now Sherlock P. Holmes of New York City, who has this sort of peculiar Southern American accent that Wodehouse tries to represent, saying things like consequently and I calculate and things like this. And but he says he's been in the United States so long, trucking down the toughs, that I reckon I've acquired the American accent some. And it's very affectionate, actually. I mean, as Wodehouse loved Conan Doyle, it's very affectionate. But it is interesting because I think it does speak to a kind of undercurrent of concern that here was Sherlock Holmes being appropriated by the Americans. And in fact, right now, there's exactly the same debate going on about Doctor Who, which is now being funded by Disney. And there was the same when it came back in the 90s very briefly. So, there's this worry that actually a sort of British cultural property could be appropriated or acquired elsewhere. There were multiple levels of which there was some concern about what Holmes would be like when he came back.
I mean, I think it's quite brave in many ways for Doyle to do what he did in terms of resurrecting Holmes and then let's move the character on. I mean, he could easily have done the lazy thing and just said, "Oh, look, here's a box of former cases."
Yes.
And just simply written them all like The Hound of the Baskervilles and say they'd all happened before the Reichenbach, and here's the same old. But he's trying to actually move the character on.
Yes.
And say this is a different Holmes. It's the same Holmes, but it's a different Holmes because he's had more life experience and different life experience.
Yeah.
And let's see what we can do with the character.
Yeah. I think that's definitely true. So let's talk a bit about that mechanism of how he managed to get out of this hole he'd managed to write himself into, because right at the end of writing the Sherlock Holmes stories, Conan Doyle penned an article for The Strand called Mr. Sherlock Holmes to His Readers, which came out March 1927, in which he looked back at this kind of pivotal moment and he said, "I did the deed, but fortunately no coroner had pronounced upon the remains. And so, after a long interval, it was not difficult for me to respond to the flattering demand and to explain my rash act away. But he still had a kind of rash act to explain away. And I think he does this pretty neatly on the whole. I mean, he clearly goes back to the final problem and rereads it, because you see elements of that story reappear here. The air guns come back, don't they? And things like that. But actually, this is some pretty nifty footwork.
You wonder what was actually going on when he wrote the final problem, in a way, because I think in our episode on that, we refer to the air guns being mentioned. Is this something that's boiling away in his mind at that point? And the way he actually dispatches Holmes, it's written so clearly that he can bring him back. As you said, no coroner had pronounced. He did that very deliberately. So, even when he was writing that story, he's preparing in his mind for the possibility of bringing him back, whether for financial reasons or because he just, he's had a break from him, enjoyed writing them, and it's time to write them again now. So he left himself that opening, and I feel quite deliberately to do that.
Yeah. And there's been quite a lot of discussion about the mechanics of the return. And in fact, the suggestion has been made that E.W. Hornung helped Conan Doyle out. I've never been really entirely convinced of this idea. And in fact, it was recently repeated by Christopher Pittard in the new Oxford editions of Sherlock Holmes. So I think it was really Richard Lancelyn Green was talking about this as well. Because there is a sort of superficial similarity, I think, to what happens in the Raffles stories, in that at the end of the first series, The Amateur Cracksman, it's the story, The Gift of the Emperor. Raffles dives off the deck of a boat in the Mediterranean and is not seen again. And then the second series opens with his Confederate bunny going for a job with a mysterious employer, only to discover that employer is in fact Raffles. And of course, the whole thing here is Raffles has decided to play dead so he can commit crimes without detection, whereas Holmes is obviously staying dead so that he can wrap up the Moriarty gang. But that second story, where Raffles returns no sinecure, was published in Scribner's in January 1901. So very, very soon before. And it's, inconceivable, I think, that Conan Doyle would not have read it. But it doesn't feel to me like it is quite the same thing, in that Conan Doyle very explicitly says Holmes is dead at the end of the final problem, whereas it's all a bit open to interpretation in the Raffles stories. But nevertheless, he may well have got a bit of a sense of how to get out of it that way.
I mean, the Raffles one, it's really that's a classic cliffhanger.
Yeah.
More than because, as you say, with the final problem, you've got the note and everything. It's all there. Holmes wants to be believed dead.
Yeah, that's
it's
right.
Very specific.
There are other things that might have influenced him as well. I mean, we know Conan Doyle was a big fan of Dickens, and I do wonder if the case of John Harmon in Our Mutual Friend is something that he might have had in mind. John Harmon dies. Apparently dies at sea, only to be discovered as another character in disguise through the course of the story. There's another interesting plot point in that John Harmon's alter ego Rokesmith, he inveigles his way into the employ of the Boffins by saying that he will actually provide his services for free for 2 years, which has always reminded me of the Red-Headed League and what John Clay is up to. So you never know. I mean, maybe that might have been somewhere in the back of his head as well.
And you've also got, I mean, with Dickens on this line, Mystery of Edwin Drood.
Yeah.
Where Edwin disappears. We obviously we don't know, unfortunately, what happens, but there is the possibility that when the strange detective Dick Datchery appears, that might be Edwin Drood in disguise.
Yeah.
And we know that Doyle was a fan of Drood, so it's another thing that might have been on his mind.
Yeah. Sadly, when Conan Doyle communicated with Dickens at a séance,
he didn't ask him.
Dickens just told him that actually, Drood is still alive.
Yes.
But he didn't say anything else about it, really. So, the other obvious inspiration, and people have spoken about this several times, is obviously this idea of the resurrection. Again, I find it quite hard to go with this one. It's just too obvious an idea, but also because I think it was Samuel Rosenberg in the book Naked is the Best Disguise who made a very elaborate an entirely unconvincing case for this.
Yes.
Most of his arguments sort of started with the fact that Sherlock Holmes returns at Easter, and then it kind of descends from there. So I've never been entirely convinced of that one either.
No, I think Doyle would find that sort of idea, pretentious and distasteful.
Yeah, exactly. But when we get into how Conan Doyle does it, this is a really terrific piece of writing, isn't it? I mean, this is Conan Doyle demonstrating all his powers again in a way that actually does undermine that argument that I think The Return is a lesser collection.
No, it's great, the tension, that he describes getting out of the Reichenbach, and the ugly moments he has actually climbing, and then when you get Moran throwing rocks at him.
Yes.
And all that aspect. Again, we're getting into what would later be classed as John Buchan territory.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's really well written. Apart from the only thing that is Moran throwing rocks at him.
Yes.
It's all a bit crude. Whereas we noticed when Granada did their adaptation, they actually have him shooting at Holmes,
which makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't really imagine that Moran went up the side of up to the waterfall and decided not to take a rifle with him and instead just lobbed some rocks.
Some useful rocks.
It's a bit peculiar, but there you go. I do think that the reveal is very artfully done. But also, I think before that, you get some lovely glimpses of Conan Doyle's writing, particularly, I think, this opening paragraph, which is really interesting in that even the word Sherlock Holmes do not appear in that opening paragraph. Even keeping the name of the person that you're most excited to hear about until the first sentence of the second paragraph, it does string along the audience quite a lot. There's this wonderful line towards the end of that first paragraph. Let me say to the public, which has shown some interest in those glimpses which I have occasionally given them of the thoughts and actions of a very remarkable man, that they are not to blame me if I have not shared my knowledge with them, for I should have considered it my first duty to have done so, had I not been barred by a positive prohibition from his own lips, which was only withdrawn upon the 3rd of last month. So he's deliberately being kept, he's keeping Sherlock Holmes out of the narrative even then. And then, of course, when we do get him, we get Chekhov's bookseller, who turns up only to be revealed to be Sherlock Holmes in a few pages' time.
It's a wonderfully unlikely way of Holmes reappearing, and it's just, and I don't know whether this is conscious or me just reading something into it. It's always struck me as like the Crooked Man. This is very like Henry Wood physically.
Yeah.
And then, as we later find out, obviously this is Holmes in disguise, but he's also come back from India, from the East.
Yes.
And is it a deliberate kind of in-joke or just just one of those things? Just Conan Doyle reusing ideas that are always there.
Yeah, I mean that whole thing about in-jokes as well almost transfers itself, I think, to this section about the bookseller and what he's carrying. I mean, I've never really been able to go into the books in more detail, but he has this peculiar collection of books which are directly referenced. At least one of which we know is related to a friend of his. It was the great Sherlockian Bliss Austen who spotted that there was a book written by Grant Allen, one of Conan Doyle's contemporaries and somebody he knew, which is on the Attis of Catullus, translated into English verse, with dissertations on the myth of Attis, on the origin of tree worship, and on the Galliambic meter. I can't even say it. That's London 1892. I just wonder if this is, if some of these have got sort of, little in jokes that Conan Doyle is just dropping into the story for his own amusement and for his readers.
I mean, it's you then you can wander into all sorts of territories. with this sort of thing. I mean, the Holy War, I'm pretty sure must be Bunyan's Holy War. It's just I don't know whether it's the kind of thing that you'd expect an old bookseller to be carrying, these sort of classics. But the specific, he's got Catullus in there. Is this a joke on Holmes's part? Just with Watson and his interest in the ladies, and we know Catullus had some rather fruity poetry.
Yes.
And perhaps it's just Holmes pulling Watson's leg. Oh, you'd enjoy this.
Yes, that's right. Maybe. And maybe if the Grant Allen is a potential source here, you get a sense Conan Doyle is just cherry picking bits and pieces of things that he's read quite recently. In fact, the classic case in point is Baritsu, the art of the Japanese system of wrestling that he talks about, which actually was Bartitsu because it was named after E.W. Barton Wright. And he had promoted this in a series of articles in Pearson's in March and April 1899. So, as Richard Lansell Green pointed out, that was probably the most recent source. Although there is a possible other one, which is George Brown Bergen, who was the features editor, I think, for the Idler, right through to the late 1890s. And he'd written an article called Japanese Fighting Self-Defense by Sleight of Body, which had come out in October 1892 in the Idler. And Conan Doyle knew Bergen socially. There are letters between them in 1900 and 1902, so quite around this time as well. But I do like the idea that if Conan Doyle had read this little article in the Idler in October 1892, he could well have had this in his mind when he was writing the final problem. So he might have even then had it all plotted out. You never know.
Yes.
Bergen actually is also credited with a fantastic saying, which is, "It is much more comfortable to be mad and know it than to be sane and have one's doubts," which I think, frankly, we should all adopt as Sherlockians. Another article that Conan Doyle might have sort of borrowed from was called "The End of a Great Mountain Climber," which featured in the Strand in January 1903, and it was the account of an accident involving an English mountaineer called Owen Glyn Jones and 3 mountain guides, told by a member of the party who had survived. That was a chap called F.W. Hill. And the whole incident took place around Zermatt, which was where Conan Doyle had seen the Findalen Glacier some 10 years earlier when he was thinking about Sherlock Holmes' death. This was pointed out by both Richard Lansell Green and by Marcus Geiser, who did a great article on this for the Reichenbach Irregulars. I have to say, reading it again, the thing that does still stick with me somewhat is this idea that Sherlock Holmes could have kept dear Watson in the dark for quite so long. It does seem to be astonishingly cruel, even accounting for the very logical reasons he gives. But there is a problem in that, he does say that he's read Watson's account. But that was 6 months before he comes back. He had 6 months in which he could have told Watson that actually he was still alive, but he didn't bother. So it always struck me as being a little bit cruel, this.
It does strike one as rather unfair treatment of a loyal friend and colleague. But as Holmes points out, Watson, he's not always the most discreet.
No.
Of characters, and not for the wrong reasons. Usually because he's enthusiastic and bubbling over with the excitement of a story or that sort of thing. But nevertheless, you've got to be careful with him. And when you look, as we're about to, at what happens during the what has been termed the Great Hiatus, there might have been absolutely plausible. Serious political reasons as well for keeping Watson in the dark.
Yeah, I mean, this is where our experience as present-day readers and that of contemporary readers is almost completely out of sync, because this story is so resonant with the kind of British imperial concerns of the early 20th century. Any contemporary reading it would have instantly spotted the sort of scars of the Boer War and all of those tensions, because this is a whole Holmes's adventures in the Great Hiatus are just all aligned to the Great Game,
Yeah, I mean, along those lines, you can't do better than actually quote what Holmes tells Watson about what he's been doing. So you then got, I travelled for 2 years in Tibet, therefore, and amused myself by visiting Lhasa and spending some days with the head Lama. You may have read of the remarkable explorations of a Norwegian named Sigerson, but I am sure that it never occurred to you that you were receiving news of your friend. I then passed through Persia, looked in at Mecca, and paid a short but interesting visit to the Khalifa in Khartoum, the results of which I have communicated to the Foreign Office. It's all there. This is very much the concerns of the imperial government at this time. Or what's interesting is at the time that the story was published.
Yeah, that's right.
It's this way you've got to look at this story and think and take back 10 years.
Yes.
To when Holmes is supposed to have disappeared.
Yeah, I mean, a classic case in point in that is Tibet, because if we were to take the period of time that is the Great Hiatus, Britain had signed the Convention of Calcutta with China, which was purportedly giving the British access to essentially trying to force Western trade onto that part of the world and break the markets. And they discovered that actually China couldn't really uphold its side of the bargain because they didn't really have control over the Eastern Himalayas and Tibet. And so in the end, the British expedition under Younghusband went in, I think, December 1903, so after this story is published. But when this was being written, this was a real topic of discussion, was about what was going to happen in Tibet and Eastern Himalayas.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you've got, as you say, in December 1903, Younghusband takes in an armed expedition into Tibet. He'd actually gone into Tibet earlier that year. So we've got this story is published in September 1903. In the spring of 1903, Younghusband had already gone into Tibet with a smaller expedition and been largely unsuccessful in negotiations. Now, this all goes back. It's all part of the so-called Great Game between Britain and Russia in Central Asia. Russia pushing into Central Asia, Britain pushing back because they didn't want the Russians to threaten India. So you've got that going on. At this point, the Viceroy of India is Lord Curzon, and Russia is one of his obsessions and Russian ambitions in that part of the world. And what's interesting with the great hiatus aspects of this is that Holmes is in this part of the world in the early 1890s. So it's before this is happening. But in the 1890s, there was a great fear of Russian infiltration into Tibet. And one figure in particular, a chap called Angvam Dozhov, who was a Russian subject but a Tibetan nationalist, who had the ear of the 13th Dalai Lama. And his actual actions were very suspect to the British government and made them very jittery. So you have this idea of Holmes at that time going into Lhasa and trying to counterbalance the influence of characters like Dozhev.
Yes. Yeah.
So is he picking up information? It's very unlike Holmes. You know, he says he's talking to the Dalai Lama. I presume he means the Dalai Lama by the head Lama. It's all a bit of license going on here. It's something you've got to remember that this is a fiction and not get too swept up in it. But it's interesting the ideas that Doyle's playing about with here, and that the idea of Holmes as information gatherer, and then this is then passed on. And leads to what eventually Younghusband's invasion of Tibet in December 1903, which was a violent incursion and a bit of a messy operation, and it actually didn't help Britain's international standing because that had already taken a pasting with the Boer War.
Yeah.
And here's Britain going bullying poor little Tibet, so that didn't go down well either.
No. I think if you've got Holmes in there playing a part for the British government diplomatically, I'd like to think that maybe on the other side of the fence for the Russians was Moran, since we know that Moran has wrote a book on heavy game of the Western Himalayas. He must have been fairly familiar with the territory as well. So they might have been playing a longer chess game for quite a while before this all kicked off.
And it's entirely feasible with the character himself, even though he's been a British soldier. That there is this obviously he's part of the Moriarty gang, and Moriarty's main thing is he's a criminal for hire.
Yeah, exactly.
And so Moran is going to be a gun for hire, and given his character, he's not going to shy from working for the Russians if they pay him well.
Yeah. So what about the other bits that are in Holmes's description of the Great Hiatus? We've got Persia and Mecca and Khartoum.
Persia is another interesting one, because Persia very much ties into the whole Great Game issue again, because Britain was worried about Russian influence in Tehran as well. Relations between Britain and Persia at this period were pretty good, but Persia, there was turmoil. The Shah, I think it was assassinated in 1896 by a fanatic, so things were unstable at that time, and we were very much trying to just counterbalance any possible Russian influence. I mean, it is another name for the Great Game is a Tournament of Shadows.
Yes, of course.
What's going on all the time is that both Britain and Russia were jumping at shadows. And Lord Curzon, to come back to him, Persia was another one of his obsessions. He travelled in the late 1880s, early 1890s. He travelled around Central Asia extensively, and seen before he became viceroy. So he was very familiar with the area, and he spent much of 1889 into early 1890 in Persia, and he published a book, Persia and the Persian Question, in 1892. So again, did Curzon meet at any point? He'll certainly have met Mycroft and discussed things with Mycroft.
Yes.
And is this why Sherlock is sent into Persia in the 1890s? It's important. Its importance is expressed by Curzon in this way: the preservation, so far as is still possible, of the integrity of Persia must be regarded as a cardinal precept of our imperial creed. So Persia is hugely important to Curzon and people who thought like Curzon.
Yeah.
And there's another little interesting pointer with Persia, which if you look in the potted biography of Colonel Sebastian Moran, that Holmes reads out to Watson, we find out that Colonel Moran's father, Augustus Moran, had at one time been British minister to Persia.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a family connection going in there. And if you look into the history of this, from Moran's age, his father would have been minister probably in the 1850s. And in 1856, Britain actually went to war with Persia, a brief war. It's the last full war that the East India Company actually engineered for the British Empire. But the man who was behind that was our actual minister to Persia at the time, who was called Charles Augustus Murray.
Oh, fantastic. Very good. Very good. What about Khartoum?
Well, Khartoum is another one that's obviously very topical at the time the story is published. We had taken control of the Sudan again at that point, after there'd been a major British failure in the Sudan between 1884 to 1885, which had culminated in the death of General Gordon, Watson's hero, after which we'd essentially retreated from the Sudan to work out what we were going to do next. And then in the 1890s, British policy begins to push back into the Sudan.
Yeah.
In 1896, Lord Kitchener is in charge of the reconquest, and he's doing it slowly, building railways, just moving towards the dervish capital of Omdurman.
Yeah.
And what's interesting at this time, 1896, a visitor to this part of the world was Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yeah, of course.
Who had taken his wife to Egypt for health reasons, but Doyle couldn't resist going along and getting himself involved in the preparations. And he knew Kitchener and had actually moved into the Upper Nile himself, and had got himself accredited as a war correspondent. But he didn't actually get to see much action, but he did get two wonderful stories out of it: the novel "The Tragedy of the Korosko" and a short story called "The Three Correspondents," based upon some of his own experiences. So he'll have been thinking about that when he was writing the Empty House, and all this preparation ended up with the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, in which the British brought down the Dervish Empire under the Khalifa. Again, like with the Dalai Lama, it's highly unlikely that Holmes would have got a personal interview with the Khalifa, and it certainly wouldn't have been at Khartoum, because he was based at Omdurman. Khartoum was a ruin at this point. But people know that, and there is, of course, this kind of the Khalifa at Khartoum has such a nice ring to it. So yes, Holmes, if he's in the Sudan in the early 1890s, and he's obviously again checking out the territory.
Yeah.
And the Mecca reference, again, you don't know whether that's Sherlock pulling Watson's leg. I mean, it's a little reference on Doyle's part to one of his heroes, Sir Richard Burton, who had actually visited Mecca in 1853 in disguise.
Yeah, well, he would have to be in disguise. And indeed, Holmes would have to have been in disguise in Tibet as well.
Yes.
And there's another sort of small detail that really situates the writing of this, which is this reference to the air guns and the expanding bullets, which, is, was a real preoccupation of Conan Doyle around that time, because he had been incensed by the suggestion that the British had used dum-dum bullets during the Anglo-Boer War, and had in fact entered into a very significant defence of British reputation in the war in South Africa, its cause and conduct, in 1902, just a year before The Empty House was written. So that's almost certainly why the expanding bullets piece was at front of mind.
And it also is put in there to show what a dastardly rogue Moran is.
Yeah.
The fact that he'll use dum-dum bullets, that marks him out as a wrong 'un.
Yeah.
Quite definitely. There's also another, talking of the Boer War reference, a little sly reference almost, when they talk about the people that Moran's played cards against and won against. And one of these is somebody called Godfrey Milner. And of course, one of the men responsible for the Boer War is Alfred Milner, Lord Milner, as he became. So it's again just another little reference to the Boer War thrown in there.
And on the topic of disguise, you've got the wonderful reference to Sigerson as well, which of course has led lots of. It's an evocative name anyway, Sigerson, and the whole idea that Holmes's father might have been called Sigger, or an older brother called Sigger, and but I do like the fact that there is again this kind of very obvious contemporary source for where Conan Doyle's getting these ideas from, because both June Thompson and Catherine Cook have drawn attention to a Swedish explorer called Sven Hedin, who was active when The Empty House was written, and in fact had published a 2-volume account, Central Asia and Tibet, in 1903. And Catherine Cook, in looking into those volumes, has pointed out that Hedin needed an entire entourage to have got across Central Asia and Tibet, and so sort of points out that Holmes would have needed quite a lot of money and quite a lot of backing to have done it, which perhaps gives credence to this idea that he was there on unofficial, official business, as it were.
But as an addition to that, it's interesting studying Lord Curzon when he was travelling around Central Asia. He actually went on his own. He'd obviously have people with him, local guides and so on. But he made sure he planned ahead and had the latest sort of tinned foods and so on supplied to him. And he particularly recommended Cross and Blackwell soups. Yeah, so when you take all this into account, these places that Holmes is exploring, it does look like he is working as a government agent. And it makes me wonder about the events of the final problem. Is it all a setup?
Yeah.
Is his destruction of the Moriarty gang, has he been backed by the government? Because Moriarty, as we know, is a criminal for hire and will work for anybody, and would therefore represent a threat to the state, or possible threat to the state. So have Sherlock and Mycroft got their heads together to get rid of Moriarty and then stage Holmes's own death, so that Holmes can be sent off as an agent into the Middle East and Central Asia. And you go back to the final problem, it is interesting that Mycroft is definitely in on the plan, because he's the coachman who takes Watson to the station. So he's all part of the setup right from the beginning.
Yeah, and he's paying for Baker Street to be looked after as well.
Yeah, he's looking after Sherlock's bank account. He's keeping Baker Street in good condition. Presumably, there's a go-between talking to Mrs. Hudson to pay the rent and so on, because she knows Mycroft, so presumably he wouldn't do that directly.
Isn't there a fire? Is there a fire in Baker Street?
There's a fire at Baker Street in Final Problem, but presumably it hasn't gutted the place. And I have often wondered, doesn't Mrs. Hudson find this a bit strange that the rooms at Baker Street are just being kept as some sort of shrine?
Yeah,
very strange.
Yes, this brother who never turns up is suddenly keeping this place as a shrine to Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, I think it's. I strongly suspect that Mrs. Hudson was in on it, and probably Watson too. In fact, it might be the case that actually Holmes was never away, because Wisteria Lodge is set in 1892 when he's.
That's a careless slip on Watson's part, forgetting it.
Oh, what a giveaway!
But you then begin to go down the path of wondering, was the note that came from Herr Steiler, was that actually, was it Moriarty, or was it Holmes sent that note to Watson? So it's all feasible. It's all feasible and all part of the fun.
It is. I mean, and the great thing about the Sherlock Holmes stories, as we've said before, is this enormous world building that goes on, and as we've just talked about with the Great Game, it's the interweaving of real life and these great sort of the great mythos and continuity that's created, that sits behind it, all of which is we can delve into at various times. And I mean, I think this is done particularly well in The Empty House. It obviously been established well before, but I think it really comes to the fore in The Empty House, because you've got this entire middle third, which is the Great Hiatus, which is the kind of the ultimate in this kind of continuity. But then you get lots of other little bits and pieces. I really enjoy the moment where Holmes takes down his collection of M's. His index for M's. My collection of M's is a fine one. Moriarty himself is enough to make any letter illustrious. And here is Morgan the poisoner, and Merridew of abominable memory, and Matthews, who knocked out my left canine in the waiting room at Charing Cross. Just wonderful things. But, you get, arguably through that, because of this kind of approach, Empty House is one of those stories that really builds up the mythology of Moriarty. In a way that actually we don't really get that much in the final problem. I think when we discussed this in episode 34, we were saying that you don't really get to see Moriarty in action all that much. Holmes is always telling you about how important and significant it is, but you don't see him in action. Whereas in The Empty House, you get a bit more of the meat on this. You get the sense of this big organization and the fact that it's been, it's been whittled down. One of my favorite lines in all of this is about Parker the Garrotter, who Holmes describes as harmless. which means he's probably not a very good
garrotter.
Did he forget to bring his rope or something? I mean, it's just, oh dear, I love it. But yeah, all of this stuff, Empty House is so rich in all of this mythos, and that's part of the thing that makes it so enjoyable, I think.
Well, you've also got it's interesting going into this sort of area with this world building and fiction meeting reality. To come back to the idea of the great game and this popular awareness of the great game and the imperial maneuverings, but you've got at a similar time to The Empty House, two great novels set around the great game. John Buchan's The Half-Hearted, published in 1900, and of course Kim, by Rudyard Kipling, which is the great game novel, published in 1901. So this is very much in the cultural atmosphere of the time, and it's interesting talking about Buchan within this context, where you talk about world building and Buchan. I don't know whether he takes lessons from Doyle on this, but he does the same thing with his. You've got the Hannay novels and the Lethen novels, and they cross over. The characters between the two sets cross over. So he has this world building, and also one of the main things you'll get in Buchan's thrillers is this kind of the politics of paranoia.
Yes,
that are there in the Powerhouse and the 39 Steps, and that's very much Holmes and the Moriarty gang. This kind of air of paranoia is there all the time as well, and you've got this with Holmes in The Final Problem with the air guns and I'm being hunted, and Buchan goes very much on these lines as well. So both The Final Problem and The Empty House are very much kind of precursors of the way thriller stories are going to go.
It's interesting you should say that, because as you're talking, I'm just wondering about Greenmantle and the Great Hiatus, and the sort of mechanics of the plot of Greenmantle and what is happening with a Westerner undercover, as it were. Do we know if Buchan read any Conan Doyle or had any interest?
I don't know of any definite proof. I've in my own mind, I have no doubt. That he'll have read Doyle and he'll have learned lessons from Doyle's writings, and to me this is the next stage on.
Yes, it's the evolution.
Is the evolution in from the detective story into the thriller story.
Into the thriller, definitely.
And this will then go on to Ian Fleming later on, with the Bond novels, and of course later on with the Bond series, Fleming kills Bond off at least twice.
Yes,
in From Russia with Love and You Only Live Twice. So it's I do see The Final Problem and The Empty House as hugely important stories. In setting up this type of fiction. And putting down early places and markers of how to do this.
And it's and the odd thing about this story is that the kind of the mystery that's at the heart of it, or at least the mystery that we open with, the Park Lane mystery, is the lesser of the three components of this story to some extent.
Yeah, it's odd in a way, because it's both pointing backwards and pointing forwards, the whole Park Lane mystery, because you've got, it is a classic locked room. So you're going back to the murders in the Rue Morgue, but you're also looking forward to kind of John Dixon Carr and that school of Golden Age detective fiction.
It's a bit of an odd solution to a locked room mystery that the window is open.
but there's no way, it's still a locked room mystery in that, there's no way that anybody could have, there's no marks. So it is a locked room mystery.
It is.
In that that nobody's been in there.
It fits the bill.
Yes, Doyle doing his version of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we get into this final third of the story, we were saying before about how Conan Doyle was picking up influences and contributions from various different sources to support this, and in in the letter that I refer to right at the top, where he writes to his mother in March 1903, he added this little detail. I have finished the first one. The plot, by the way, was given me by Jean, and it's a rare good one. You will find that Holmes was never dead, and he is now very much alive. Now, that Jean is Jean Leckie, who'd become his second wife. And I've always assumed that the detail that she gives is the Ronald Adair plot, is the card scandal plot. But I don't think there's any particular evidence one way or the other as to what she contributed.
No, I think all we know is what you've said. That there's no further detail. But you would think that would be the part rather than the great hiatus aspect.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Of it. Which with all its the political and world building elements, it really has the marks of Doyle about it.
Absolutely does. And the Ronald Adair plot, I think, has got a more direct and obvious predecessor in the Royal Baccarat scandal from 1890, also known as the Tranby Croft affair. And this was the scandal that arose when the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, was staying with the Wilson family in Tranby Croft, which is just outside Hull. And one of the guests there, Sir William Gordon Cumming, a lieutenant colonel in the Scots Guards, was accused of cheating. And essentially what happened was, with the Prince's support, the guests forced Gordon Cumming to write a confession that basically said he would not play cards again, and they would undertake not to spread this rumor. Except, of course, what happened was it got out. And Gordon Cumming, rather than sort of taking this lying down, decided to sue the Wilson family, and it became a celebrated court case. And in the end, he lost, and he was thrown out of the British Army the following day and ostracized. But this is clearly something that Conan Doyle picks up on. I mean, when he wrote The Five Orange Pips, which was only a year after this scandal, he mentioned about Major Prendergast and the scandal of the Tankerville Club. And the Tankerville Club gets mentioned again in this story because it's part of Moran's biography. Another story he wrote around the same time as The Five Orange Pips was A Regimental Scandal, which came out in May 1892. And that obviously plays on the Tranby Croft affair, but it has an interesting twist, which I'm not going to spoil on the podcast for those who've not read it. But you also got a card scandal in The Hound of the Baskervilles with Colonel Upward of the Nonpareil Club. So, I think this is there's a fairly obvious precursor for the Ronald Adair plot. You can see where he's sort of pulling on those threads for that one.
And he's also at this time still writing Napoleonic stories, and the Regency period is in his head as well. And obviously, there's a lot of this comes into Rodney Stone in 1896.
Yes,
you've got cards always come into that sort of period, and Doyle retained a fascination with this to the end, because one of his last stories was the end of Devil Hawker, which is a kind of Regency version of Moran.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So let's now come on to talk about Colonel Sebastian Moran, who we've skirted around so far in the podcast, but he's a terrific figure. And, there's great evidence of world building in Conan Doyle's description of Moran and Moran's background.
Yeah, I mean, we get a pretty good description of the background when Holmes hands Watson the potted biography, which reads: Moran, Sebastian, Colonel, unemployed, formerly 1st Bengalore Pioneers, born London 1840, son of Sir Augustus Moran, C.B., once British Minister in Persia, educated Eton and Oxford, served in Jawaki campaign, Afghan campaign, Charathiab dispatches, Sherpur and Kabul. Author of Heavy Game of the Western Himalayas, 1881, 3 Months in the Jungle, 1884. Address, Conduit Street, clubs: the Anglo-Indian, the Tankerville, the Bagatelle Card Club. So you got a really good potted biography there. Just gives you a sense of the man.
Yeah.
Interesting. The regiment is a fictitious one. The Bangalore Pioneers. Interesting that he's in a pioneer regiment, so more associated with being a sapper.
Yeah.
Whereas these sort of cads are usually cavalry officers or that sort of, or disgruntled infantry officers. But obviously the Indian background's all there. And I've always found it fascinating myself when you read the campaigns there, that he obviously served in the Second Afghan War. So he might have been rubbing shoulders with Watson.
Yeah, absolutely.
At some point during that campaign. And of course, a nice touch is the books he's written. It would have been even nicer if they'd put 2 volumes. But
it is
the usual for that period.
It is wonderful.
But he's given a good fleshed out background there, and it is this background that fits in with Watson's astonishment of this is the background of an honourable soldier.
Indeed.
What's happened here? How could this man be Moriarty's chief lieutenant?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, although he does say he was educated at Eton and Oxford, he also wears an opera hat, which I think is the sure sign of a bounder, isn't it? Really. So, but the description of Moran is fantastic as well. When you actually get to meet him in person, the description. It was a tremendously virile and yet sinister face, which was turned towards us, with the brow of a philosopher above and the jaw of a sensualist below. The man must have started with great capacities for good or for evil, but one could not look upon his cruel blue eyes with their drooping cynical lids, or upon the fierce aggressive nose and the threatening deep-lined brow, without reading nature's plainest danger signals. Well, it's a great description. I do think also, again, that's another Conan Doyle, not liking sensualists. That's a no-no. Douglas Stone in Lady Sannox is another sensualist. But you get that reference in there as well to must have started with great capacities for good or for evil, which ties into something that Sherlock Holmes then goes on to talk about later, which is there are some trees, Watson. That speech about which is about our old friend atavism, which Conan Doyle comes back to time and time again. This idea that, as Holmes says, the person becomes, as it were, the epitome of the history of his own family. It is surely rather fanciful. Well, I don't insist upon it, he says. Just throw that one in there. So you get this idea that Moran is this is the summation of his family line, and it does make you think about what he was like as a young man, maybe if he was a sort of sapper, or how he what he got involved in. But actually, someone else has done that for us.
Oh yes, we have George MacDonald Fraser in Flashman and the Tiger, which published in 1997, which is a joyful homage to this story, where we get some of the background to Moran really fleshed out, where Flashman encounters him first following the Battle of Isandlwana in the Zulu War, and then both Flashman and Moran end up involved in the defence of Rorke's Drift. What is interesting here is that Moran's involvement in the Zulu War isn't mentioned in Holmes's biography. So Holmes is obviously a bit careless in his information gathering. But yes, if Flashman's first encounter with Moran, he encounters him some 15 years later in a very different guise of. Flashman works him out as the card sharp, and there's all sorts of other shenanigans involving Flashman's granddaughter. But all of this leads to Flashman also being there in Camden House on the night of the attempted murder of Sherlock Holmes. It's very cleverly put together. It's a wonderful piece of storytelling. And, I won't go into too much detail because I would recommend people
Yes.
go out and read the story themselves.
Yeah, and there is the card shop bit is again borrowed on the Tranby Croft affair as well. And in fact, it is the Tranby Croft affair, isn't it? I think, if I remember rightly.
Yes, yeah.
But it's worth saying that the capture of Moran is a lot more entertaining in Flashman and the Tiger than it is in The Empty House.
And the other aspect that Fraser does capture of this story is something I've always felt is the kind of the sense of the oddity of the building itself. This odd, creepy, empty building on Baker Street, and it's often struck me. I think I've said this before. The speckled band, parts of that has always struck me as being like a haunted house story.
Yeah.
In the way it's set up, and I feel that with this story as well, that there's very much the air, certainly within the house scenes of the haunted house, the classic Victorian haunted house or ghost story, which Doyle was always interested in. I mean, he'd actually taken part in at least one real life ghost hunt with his involvement with the Society for Psychical Research. And of course, the earliest surviving story of Doyle's is a story from the mid-1870s called The Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe, which is very much a piece of Prentice work, very overwritten, and you can see the direction he's going. But he's obviously got this great interest in the ghost story, and one of the most famous ghost stories of the Victorian period is The Haunters and the Haunted, which was published in 1859 by Edward Bulwer-Lytton, which Doyle in Through the Magic Door described as the very best ghost story that I know. So he's a huge fan of it, and that involves a deserted mansion somewhere to the north of Oxford Street, which is a similar setting.
Yeah.
To Camden House on Baker Street. But if you look at the language that he uses in The Empty House, I mean, say Bulwer-Lytton's story is called The Haunters and the Haunted, and you've got this within The Empty House. My friend's plans were gradually revealing themselves. From this convenient retreat, the watchers were being watched, and the trackers tracked. So the haunters and the haunted, the hunters and the hunted, essentially is what we're going on into this story. And then the description of when Holmes and Watson enter Camden House. The place was pitch dark, but it was evident to me that it was an empty house. Our feet creaked and crackled over the bare planking, and my outstretched hand touched a wall from which the paper was hanging in ribbons. Holmes's cold, thin fingers closed round my wrists and led me forward down a long hall until I dimly saw the murky fanlight over the door. Here Holmes turned suddenly to the right, and we found ourselves in a large, square, empty room, heavily shadowed in the corners, but faintly lit in the centre from the lights of the street beyond. There was no lamp near, and the window was thick with dust, so that we could only just discern each other's figures within. I mean, that's the language of a ghost story. That is a haunted house. It's setting up that creepy atmosphere, which will then crash into the atmosphere of an adventure story when Moran enters. And it's a fascinating juxtaposition.
I think and that sort of takes us to the title of this story, really, in many ways. In that it does sound like the title of a ghost story more than it sounds like the story of an adventure story. I mean, it's always struck me as being quite a boring title, almost a deliberately boring title to sort of to announce the return of Sherlock Holmes. But I think it's also a very clever one in that, as you just read in that passage, Camden House is the empty house that Watson refers to, but equally Baker Street could be the empty house. We've had an absence of Sherlock Holmes for all this period of time.
Presumably, during those 3 years' absence, Watson will have taken a nostalgic wander down Baker Street and looked at the old windows and mused upon the emptiness.
That's it. Yeah, absolutely. The thing that has perplexed me somewhat is that, we find out later that Colonel Moran somehow escaped the death penalty. Because in Illustrious Client, we hear that he is the living Colonel Sebastian Moran, and that's set, 1902, something like that. So what on earth happened?
You have to think, well, was he deemed insane, or was it the fact that this would raise too much in the press about his
Maybe.
background and too many stories, and there are numerous reasons you could see
Yeah.
as to why not, but I seem to recall, I think Flashman actually talks about him being hanged. So
Oh, right. Okay.
who knows?
Well, you see, in this, it looks like he might have got away with it. In which case, maybe he just knew too much, or maybe he was secretly working for Mycroft as well. In which case,
maybe he disappeared into Central Asia.
Yeah, let's leave him there. So that brings us to the end of the podcast. And if you would like to read the show notes, you can find them at doingsofdoyle.com. And if you're interested in supporting the podcast, then please look at our website to find out details of how you can become a sponsor, or leave us a rating or review on your podcaster of choice. So, Paul, what's the topic of the podcast next time?
Next time, we're going to be conducting another interview show with Andrew Lycett, author of the 2007 biography, Conan Doyle, but he's also brought out a new book on Holmes called The Worlds of Sherlock Holmes.
Brilliant. So we look forward to speaking to Andrew, and that podcast will be out in the middle of next month, slightly ahead of our normal monthly schedule. And we'll be back with a regular show at the end of November. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye. Cockaliki. It's just the way I'm standing.
What you are about to see will change the way you feel about soup. Because inside every carton of new four-season soup is the fresh taste of nature. Simply snip and pour to enjoy the richness of 5 garden vegetables in a meaty beef stock. Or this smoky blend of lentils and bacon. You'll never feel the same about soup again once you've tried the fresh taste of nature captured in every carton of four-season soup from Cross and Blackwell.